Hello everyone, thanks for checking out this sneaker customization. Today we're going to be turning the UNC to Chicago Jordan 1s into whatever I decide to name these in the title of the video. First up, materials, starting with the absolutely required stuff. You're going to want some acetone, cotton rounds and Q-tips, tape, pencil, Angelus paints, brushes, these three are good, one long hair round for line work, a filbert for the bigger stuff, and a large flat to lay down some large base colors on panels. And finally, you're going to want some matte sealer. For the optional stuff, you're going to want a playing card to clean up some edges, a toothpick for the toe box, and some Foxtrott Uniform stainer if you want a sail midsole. All of this is going to be in the description below. Start by taping off all the edges that you don't want to get paint on. The neater you are here, the less you'll have to do later. To go around the curves, just use a bunch of small pieces of tape. Take a cotton round with some acetone and start wiping down the panels you plan on painting on to strip off the factory finish. For the wings logo, most of it will come off by itself, but you can use a toothpick to help pick up the stubborn pieces. The wipe down shoe should be a bit lighter and completely matte with no shine. Make sure there's absolutely no finish left, otherwise your paint won't stick to the shoe correctly. Once you finish with the acetone, you can start blocking in the big panels. I use the large flat to cover a lot of the space at once. I'm using pretty thin layers here. If you lay down the paint too heavy, it'll do a couple things. One, dry slower, and two, it'll crack on you in the first wear if you go way too heavy. We're going for the thinnest opaque white we can get. It takes me about 5 layers. You'll notice paint sometimes get into the toe box holes. It'll dry flat so you don't really have to worry about it, but if it bothers you, you can just use a toothpick to clean it up. Leather's got a bit of depth to it, so don't forget to paint the edges if it's a different color than how you want the leather to look when it's all done. The last big panels are the swooshes. They're real curvy, so I just use a lot of tape and the playing card to try to get some of the tape under the leather. Alright, now that the blocking is all done, time for the fun part, the flowers. You can't see it here, but I have pictures of flowers on my computer screen as a reference. I'm just making a rough sketch to give myself an idea of how I want to place the flower on the panel. Take your time and don't worry too much about how the sketch looks, and erase as much as you want. Only the placement really matters here. This is going to let you avoid the problem of you thinking that it's placed like shit after you finished all of the painting. Once you're happy with the placement, use the sketch to start the final line work. This is where having a nice long bristle brush really comes in handy. This is going to let you hold a lot more paint at once in a single stroke, and will come to a finer point than any of those crappy $3 brush packs you see a lot of people recommend for these kinds of customs. I've seen a lot of people trying to do line work with really cheap size 0 detail brushes they get from a crappy 12 pack, but that's mostly just a good way to torture yourself. The picture here shows the difference between brushes with long and short bristles for line work like I'm doing here. Most people will assume that the bottom one is smaller, so it probably makes thinner lines, but that's not really its purpose. Both of these brushes are a bit wet, and you can see that the extra length on the top brush really lets the surface tension keep everything to an extremely sharp point. Cheaper brushes also tend to fray because the water just can't hold the bristles together, and generally the bristles themselves are a lot chunkier. Save yourself the trouble and buy a longer fine tip brush, and generally avoid the big packs of brushes. Ultimately, you're probably not going to use most of them anyway. Once you're happy with the line work, put down a wash of your neutral color, something right in the middle so that you can add shadows and highlights later on. Alright, here I'm putting some gold down for the stamen of the flowers. Gold really doesn't like to spread out, so go really thin here and just try to get 2 layers in. Should be pretty opaque. I'm using a filbert here for the shadow base to add a little bit of depth. It might just look like I'm putting down water, but you want to dilute the paint a lot to get more of a stained effect. I'm using the thin round here to work up the shadows now. Work from the inside of the flower out to get those tapered edges. Again, thin your paints a lot. It's a lot easier to add more paint than it is to remove it later. I should have done this earlier, but I forgot. So now I'm just putting in the base gold layer for the core of the flower. Apparently I didn't record any of myself painting in the stamen, but you can see me cleaning the edges and touching it up now. I started by just outlining everything with a bright red. Here I'm going back in with darker reds to make a gradient to add some more depth and visual interest. The red outline gets brighter the closer it is to the center of the flower to give it a subtle glow effect. You don't really have to do this, but I personally just like how it looks. For the empty red space, I'm just using a champagne color and just kind of filling it in with some lines. I'm using the brightest red that I have to start adding the highlights now. You want to work in the reverse of the shadows here, from the outside of the petals in, so that the two tapered edges meet. This is easily my favorite part, as you can see the final flower really start to take shape. You have most of everything together now. Alright, blending time. You can see that there's kind of a hard edge between the highlights and the shadows. I don't really like this look, so we're just going to do some wet on wet painting to blend it together. Take your mid-red paint and start putting down thin strokes between the highlights and the shadows. While the paint is still wet, take your highlight and shadow colors and use the still wet surface to soften some of the edges. This is a somewhat technical step as you really have to get used to how paint mixes. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with a uniform color instead of soft edges. If you're new to painting, I wouldn't really recommend it, honestly. Most people won't even notice this subtle a detail if these are on your feet anyway. As a painter, though, the contrast between some hard and soft edges on a finished work are some of the most satisfying parts to look at in a finished painting. We put a lot of thin coats of paint over the original line work, so it's probably starting to look a little blurry now. I'm going over parts of the line work now in black to just pull some of those lines back to the surface. Finally, just touching up areas that I think could use a bit more work, and we're done with one of the flowers. Once you're done with the flowers and peel back the tape, there might be paint on edges of the sneakers that you don't want. Use the playing card to wedge under the leather and fix any of these errors. Last step you really need to do is just to put the matte finish on. Just put on 1 to 2 thin coats on all of the painted surfaces. A small amount really goes a long way here. Don't worry if you see any bubbles or a cloudiness at first when you put it on, it'll dry flat and clear. An optional step that I took was just to use a midsole stainer. It'll give it that sail midsole that myself and the community really seems to love these days. And that's it. Thanks for coming by. The next pair I think I want to work on is some A6 gel sights. I'm not really sure what theme I want to do yet. I was thinking maybe like a vintagey Halloween pair. I'm not sure. That probably won't be ready for like 2 years because I'm really slow with these. But if you have any recommendations, questions, or comments, feel free to let me know in the comments under the video. See you next time.